In the fall of 1894, Mill Creek, Missouri, was the kind of town where people knew every horse by name and every family by reputation. Life followed the rhythm of the seasons: planting, harvesting, church on Sundays, and the occasional town gathering. But that autumn, something unsettling began to ripple through the quiet routines. The whispers started with the farmers. Old Mr. Callahan swore his cows stampeded into the woods after Eli Thompson, an 8-year-old boy, walked past his pasture. Another farmer claimed his hens refused to lay eggs whenever Eli lingered by the coop. Even the dogs, usually loyal and fearless, barked wildly in his presence. Shopkeepers reported stranger things still. One swore he heard murmurs behind him while Eli stood at the counter, though no one else was there. Another claimed the boy's shadow seemed to move even when Eli was perfectly still. Mill Creek was a place where superstition mingled easily with faith, and soon everyone was talking. One sentence passed from porch to porch, from pew to pew. "There's something about that boy that frightens me." Eli Thompson was small for his age, with pale skin that rarely caught the sun, and eyes of a startling gray-blue that seemed to pierce through anyone who dared meet them too long. His father had died of fever when Eli was only 5, leaving his mother, Martha, to raise him alone. She worked long hours as a seamstress, often stitching clothes by the light of a single candle, her tired eyes watching over her son. Eli kept mostly to himself. While other children played marbles in the dirt or swam in the creek, he wandered the edges of the woods, picking up odd stones, twigs, and bones. He carried them home and arranged them in patterns only he understood. When school was in session, the children avoided the bench beside him. He never laughed, never joined games, and never looked surprised at anything. Once, a boy tried to mock him, chanting, "Ghost eyes, ghost eyes." Eli said nothing, only stared at him until the boy turned pale and ran home, shaken, as though he'd seen something far worse than a quiet child. By the time Eli was 8, Mill Creek's children had decided he wasn't one of them, and the adults, though they tried to be polite, whispered behind closed doors. It happened on a Wednesday, just after the sun had climbed above the trees. The church bell began to toll, deep, thunderous strikes that rattled the town square. People rushed out of homes and shops, frightened. Bells only rang for 2 reasons in Mill Creek: a fire or a death. But no fire blazed. No death had been announced. The church doors were locked, the tower empty. Yet the bell swung with wild force, its rope snapping against the wooden frame. And who had been seen standing quietly in the grass near the church? Eli. His eyes were fixed not on the tower, but on the sky, as if he were watching something invisible moving above them. When townsfolk shouted, "Boy, what are you doing here?" he simply turned and walked away, saying nothing. That night, people muttered to one another in hushed tones. A few said it was a coincidence, but most whispered what they truly believed. The boy had called the bell himself. At the one-room schoolhouse, Eli was always silent, his slate filled with neat handwriting, his answers correct but never explained. One morning, Miss Abigail, their teacher, began reciting lessons about the Civil War. She spoke of battles and generals, reading from the same textbook the town had used for years. But Eli, for the first time, interrupted her. "That isn't what happened," he said, his voice calm, almost apologetic. The class fell silent. Miss Abigail raised her brow. "And what do you mean, Eli?" He stood, his small hands trembling as though with some unseen weight. Then, with astonishing clarity, he described an obscure skirmish near a river, naming soldiers, dates, even the position of their regiments. His account was so vivid, so detailed, the classroom grew still with unease. Miss Abigail scolded him for speaking out of turn, but later that night, curious and unsettled, she pulled out her father's old war journal. To her astonishment, Eli's account matched it word for word. She told no one, but the image of the pale boy standing in her classroom describing a war he had never lived through would haunt her. By winter, Mill Creek was no longer united in its opinion of Eli Thompson. Half the town believed he was a curse, a child touched by darkness, sent to bring ruin. These folks crossed themselves when he passed, whispering prayers under their breath. Mothers forbade their children from even looking at him. The other half weren't so sure. Some whispered he was a prophet, a child given sight from heaven. They remembered biblical stories of children chosen for divine purposes. Between these two groups, tension simmered. Families argued in kitchens, friends quarreled at the general store. The boy himself seemed untouched by it all, his gray-blue eyes staring past both praise and condemnation as though he saw something beyond the reach of ordinary men. Late in November, thunder rolled across Mill Creek. Dark clouds gathered with unusual speed, the air heavy with electricity. Farmers hurried to bring animals into barns. Mothers called children from the fields. Eli sat barefoot on his porch, unflinching as the storm raged. Neighbors watched uneasily as lightning tore the sky in jagged streaks. One bolt split a tree not 30 yards from his cabin, sparks flying. Yet Eli only whispered softly, as though speaking to someone no one else could see. Just as the lightning veered toward his neighbor's barn, it flickered and vanished. The storm shifted, the worst of it rolling past the town. Some said Eli had stopped the strike. Others whispered he had called the storm in the first place. Either way, fear deepened in their hearts. Pastor Green was a stout, serious man who guided Mill Creek's souls with stern sermons and a heavy hand on the Bible. He had watched Eli for months, unease building in his heart. One cold evening he called Martha, Eli's mother, into his study. Candlelight flickered against the wooden walls as he spoke. "Your son is not normal," he said bluntly. "He frightens the people. And when people are frightened, they can be cruel. I fear what may happen to him if this continues." Martha's hand shook as she defended her child. "He is only a boy, Pastor. He has harmed no one." But deep down, even she struggled with questions she dared not ask aloud. Sometimes when Eli spoke in his sleep, it was in voices she didn't recognize. Tommy Miller, a curious boy of 9, had more courage or foolishness than most. One afternoon he followed Eli into the woods. Crouching behind a tree, he watched as Eli knelt in a clearing, eyes closed, lips moving. Birds swooped down to perch on branches around him, chirping softly. A fox padded into the circle, settling at Eli's side as though tame. Tommy's heart raced. He bolted home, breathless, telling everyone who would listen, "Eli's commanding the animals. They obey him like soldiers." By sunset, the tale had spread across Mill Creek like wildfire, adding another layer of fear to the boy's already mysterious reputation. The tension finally boiled over. One Saturday, the townsfolk gathered in the square. The blacksmith shouted, "This boy brings curses. He'll ruin us all." Others argued he had saved the neighbor's barn. Voices rose, fists shook in the air. Eli was dragged into the center of the crowd, his small frame dwarfed by the angry circle of adults. They demanded he explain himself. He stood silently for a long moment, eyes lowered, then whispered, "I only see what others cannot." The words, so simple yet so chilling, silenced the crowd. But instead of answers, the statement only deepened their unease. That night, just after midnight, a scream pierced the stillness. A barn at the edge of town was ablaze, flames leaping high into the sky. Families rushed with buckets of water, desperate to save livestock. At the edge of the field stood Eli. He pointed, shouting with a voice far louder than expected from an 8-year-old. "Over there! Take the cows out first. Then open the south gate." The men obeyed, though they didn't know why, and every animal was saved. Only the barn itself was lost. But when the fire died and the ashes smoked, suspicion settled once again. Some whispered Eli had known too much, too quickly, and others muttered the most dangerous thought of all. Maybe he started the fire himself. One evening, while folding Eli's clothes, Martha found something tucked beneath his pillow. A letter. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting uneven, almost shaky, as if written by an older hand. What chilled her most was the ink. It looked faded, as though it had been penned years before. The words were simple but terrifying. Spring will bring the flood. 2 homes will be lost. 1 child will not survive the fever. Martha's hands trembled. These were not predictions a child should hold. She confronted Eli, demanding, "Where did this come from?" Eli lowered his eyes. "It was left for me." "By who?" "The voices," he whispered. Terrified, Martha threw the letter into the fire. The parchment curled and blackened in the flames, but deep down she feared it was too late. The words had already rooted themselves in her heart. Behind the fear and suspicion, Eli was still just a child. At night, while the town slept, he whittled small wooden figures, horses, birds, foxes, even little people. Then, quietly, he placed them on doorsteps before dawn. Families would wake to find these carvings, marveling at their detail. Children clutched them as toys, never knowing they came from the boy they avoided at school. Though Eli never said it aloud, this was his way of reaching out, of saying, "I want to be part of you. I don't want to be alone." But the townsfolk, blind to the gesture, continued to whisper in fear. One cold morning, Eli approached Pastor Green outside the church. His voice was steady but urgent. "Don't send the miners tomorrow," he warned. "The earth will fall." The pastor stiffened, troubled but unwilling to show it. "You shouldn't say such things, boy. It stirs fear where there need be none." The next day, the miners went to work as always. By noon, the ground shook. A shaft collapsed, trapping 5 men. Only 3 were pulled out alive. When the bodies of the others were carried through town, the widow's wails pierced the air. Eyes turned toward Eli, some filled with awe, most with dread. He had been right, again. And this time 2 men were dead. That night, anger boiled over. A group of men, fathers, farmers, men who had lost friends in the mine, stormed Eli's cabin. They pounded on the door, shouting, "Bring the boy out! He's cursed us all." Martha shielded her son, standing between him and the men. "He is my child," she cried. "He has done nothing to you." But the mob's faces were twisted with grief and fury. They demanded Eli be cast out of Mill Creek. Eli stepped forward, his small frame dwarfed by the men's shadows. He met each man's eyes, one by one, with that calm, piercing gaze. One by one, their anger faltered, their fists lowered. Something in his quiet sadness broke through their rage. Without a word, they turned and left, muttering curses under their breath but unable to lay a hand on him. The next day, Eli asked to speak in the town square. The people gathered reluctantly, curiosity outweighing fear. He stood before them, hands shaking, voice trembling. "I don't want to frighten you," he began. "I don't want to be different. But I can't stop seeing what I see. It comes to me like dreams, even when I'm awake. Sometimes it helps, sometimes it hurts. But I never asked for it." His words were not those of a prophet or a monster. They were the words of an 8-year-old boy, begging simply to be accepted. A few mothers wept quietly, but the fear in others was too strong to fade overnight. Spring came with heavy rains. For days the skies poured, the river swelling until it pressed hard against its banks. The townsfolk grew frantic, stacking sandbags, hauling wood, praying the waters would hold. Eli stood by the river, staring intently. Then he shouted, "Build the barrier higher, over there." Some ignored him, but a few, desperate, followed his instructions. Hours later, the river surged exactly where he had warned, crashing against the hastily built wall. The barrier held. The floodwaters, though fierce, were turned aside. Mill Creek was saved. For the first time, the townsfolk looked at Eli not with fear, but with gratitude. The flood changed everything. Mothers embraced their children, realizing they might have been swept away without Eli's warning. Fathers gripped his shoulder with a respect they had never shown before. Even Pastor Green, once his greatest critic, knelt before him in the churchyard. "Forgive me," he said, voice breaking. "I feared what I did not understand." For the first time, Eli smiled, a small, fleeting smile, but one that lit his pale face like the sun breaking through clouds. The boy who had once frightened everyone was now the boy they quietly relied upon. That night, Eli sat with his mother by the fire. His voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Sometimes I hear voices, not scary ones, gentle ones. They tell me things that haven't happened yet." Martha's eyes filled with tears. "Whose voices, Eli?" He looked at the fire. "I think they're the voices of those who came before us. People who lived here long ago. They don't want to be forgotten. They want to help." Martha pulled him close, her arms tight around him. "Then you are not cursed, my son. You are a bridge." As years passed, Eli grew but never lost his quiet strangeness. He was never quite one of the crowd, never fully embraced, yet always respected. He became a quiet guardian of Mill Creek. When storms came, he knew where to fortify. When sickness spread, he knew which herbs to use. When despair threatened, his presence alone seemed to steady hearts. He did not speak often, but when he did, people listened. The boy who had once been shunned now carried the town's trust on his shoulders. Decades later, long after Eli had grown into a man and passed on, Mill Creek's children still whispered his story. "The boy who frightened everyone," they called him. "The boy whose stare could freeze a room, whose words foretold the future, whose strangeness once divided the town." But as generations retold his story, the fear faded. What remained was reverence. His warnings had saved lives. His courage had preserved families. His gift, once a curse in their eyes, had been their greatest blessing. And so the moral lived on. What we fear most is often what we need most. Sometimes the outcast carries the light we cannot yet see.